On the frigid morning of February 8, 1587, a queen, anointed and crowned, made her final walk toward death. She carried herself with an unbroken dignity, wholly unaware that the last moments of her life would be remembered not for royal solemnity, but for a display of such savage incompetence that it would forever stain the annals of history. What was intended to be a clean, merciful conclusion to decades of political strife devolved into a gruesome spectacle, a botched and bloody affair that would sear itself into the memory of all who witnessed it. Mary Stuart, once Queen of Scots, had been a ruler of nations and a commander of men. Her life was a tapestry of courtly conspiracy, religious warfare, and long years spent as a captive. Yet, on this bleak winter day at Fotheringhay Castle, she confronted her ultimate ordeal, to uphold her sovereign grace while an executioner's ineptitude subjected her to a final, public degradation. The horrific events of that day would not be forgotten, serving as a grim lesson on the nature of power, the perversion of justice, and the razor-thin edge separating statecraft from sheer cruelty. This is the story of Mary's end, a queen who, through a series of ghastly errors, was forced to die not once, but 3 times, before she could find her final release. In an era that held royal blood to be almost sacred, the execution of Mary was far more than the state-sanctioned killing of a conspirator. It represented a brutal convergence of deep-seated religious animosity, a bitter dynastic feud, and the cold, unyielding pragmatism that defined Renaissance politics. The latter half of the 16th century was a period of violent transformation across Europe. The Protestant Reformation had irrevocably fractured the spiritual unity of Christendom, igniting brutal conflicts between Catholics and Protestants that would burn for generations. Under the rule of Elizabeth I, England had become a bastion of Protestantism. To Catholic empires like Spain and France, it was a rogue state, a heretical blight on the continent's rightful order. Mary Stuart's very being was a direct and existential threat to Elizabeth's throne. As a devout Catholic with a powerful and legitimate claim to the English crown through her Tudor lineage, Mary embodied the deepest fears of England's Protestant leadership, the specter of foreign domination, the return of papal power, and the complete overthrow of their established faith. From the moment of her birth in 1542, Mary had been a pawn in the high-stakes game of European power dynamics, her marriages arranged to forge alliances and her status used as a political tool by kingdoms far mightier than her native Scotland. Her own reign in Scotland had collapsed into chaos, marred by political blunders, marriages that created scandal, and grave accusations of her involvement in murder, all of which led to the loss of her throne. In 1567, she fled to England, casting herself upon the mercy of her cousin, Elizabeth, naively expecting a bond of solidarity between 2 queens. What she received was not sanctuary, but a cage. She became a prisoner, her very life now subject to the turbulent currents of international relations and the ongoing religious wars. For 19 long years, Mary was moved between various English castles, a captive queen whose existence was a potent symbol that Elizabeth and her council could not afford to overlook. It seemed that every Catholic plot devised against Elizabeth's life inevitably featured Mary as its intended beneficiary and figurehead, regardless of her actual involvement. The Babington plot of 1586 became the final, damning piece of evidence. It provided Elizabeth's government, led by spymaster Sir Francis Walsingham and the calculating Lord Burleigh, with the justification they had long sought to permanently eliminate the threat that was Mary Stuart. The choice to execute Mary was a monumental one, and Elizabeth was said to have agonized over it, hesitating for months after Mary was found guilty of treason by Parliament in October 1586. She understood that to kill an anointed queen, a divinely appointed ruler, would establish a perilous precedent. Catholic powers abroad had already issued stark warnings, threatening open war should any harm befall Mary. Nevertheless, her Protestant inner circle was adamant, insisting that the very survival of England hinged on Mary's death. The death warrant was finally signed in February 1587, yet Elizabeth would later vehemently claim she never gave the order for it to be dispatched immediately. Whether her delay was born of genuine moral turmoil or was a piece of shrewd political maneuvering, the Queen's ambivalence added yet another layer of controversy to Mary's tragic end. The selection of Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire as the site for the execution was deeply symbolic. It was a medieval fortress, a place long associated with both royal authority and severe punishment. The castle's great hall, where the scaffold was erected, had been the backdrop for countless acts of political theater over the centuries. The location was chosen to underscore the solemnity of the event while ensuring it was far removed from the potentially sympathetic masses of London. As the day of February 8, 1587, arrived, the stage was meticulously prepared for one of the most infamous executions in British history. All the simmering conflicts, the religious wars devastating Europe, the deeply personal rivalry between two powerful queens, and the brutal realpolitik of the Tudor state, were about to collide in a single moment of shocking, unforgettable butchery. The dawn broke cold and grey over the stone walls of the castle. Mary Stuart had passed her final night in deep prayer, surrounded by the devoted servants who had remained with her throughout her long imprisonment. At 44, the woman once celebrated as Europe's most stunning queen bore the physical marks of her nearly 2 decades in captivity. Despite this, her posture and presence remained undeniably royal. After the execution warrant was read to her the previous evening, Mary had accepted the news with her typical fortitude, asking only for the time to prepare her soul for its final journey. She used the dark, quiet hours to write her last letters, to distribute her meager belongings to her staff, and to commend her spirit to God. Her unwavering Catholic faith, the very thing that had cost her a crown and now her life, was her ultimate source of strength. At 8 o'clock that morning, the officials tasked with her execution arrived. The Earls of Shrewsbury and Kent, the Protestant noblemen who had been her primary jailers, came to lead her to the Great Hall. They were accompanied by the Sheriff of Northamptonshire and other dignitaries, their faces etched with the gravity of the occasion. Mary stepped out from her chambers to meet them. She was dressed in black velvet, a fitting attire for mourning, though whether she mourned for her own fate or for the state of the world was known only to her. Over the gown, she wore a pristine white veil, and at her waist hung a silver crucifix, a bold, defiant display of her Catholic identity in the heart of Protestant England. Her small group of attendants, including her physician, Burgoyne, and her loyal secretary, Melville, walked with her on this final, sorrowful procession. The group moved with deliberate slowness through the castle's corridors. Mary walked with her head held high, her gaze fixed forward, offering no acknowledgement to those who watched her pass. She refused to be hurried or treated as a common criminal. She was a queen, and she was determined to die as one. The Great Hall of Fotheringhay had been converted for the grim proceedings. A scaffold, standing 2 feet high and draped entirely in black cloth, occupied the center of the vast room. Atop it sat a single cushioned chair and the chopping block, both also shrouded in black velvet. Wooden barriers had been erected to keep the assembly of witnesses at a distance, a carefully curated audience of local gentry, government officials, and a few commoners chosen to disseminate the official account of the event. Beside the block stood the executioner, his identity concealed behind a black mask, his large frame cloaked in matching dark attire. The axe he held was not polished or bright, its edge gleamed with a dull menace in the pale winter light that streamed through the hall's high windows. Every detail had been arranged with a somber precision. Yet no one present could have foreseen how dreadfully the carefully staged event was about to unravel. As Mary entered the great hall, a profound hush descended upon the crowd. Every person in the room understood they were witnessing a pivotal, shattering moment in history, the death of a crowned and anointed queen, ordered by the state and carried out by her subjects. The very atmosphere seemed to grow heavy, charged with the volatile mixture of religious schism, political finality, and the raw human drama that would be recounted long after everyone in the hall had turned to dust. Mary ascended the 2 steps to the scaffold with the same unhurried grace that had marked her passage through the castle. The crowd watched in complete silence as she calmly took in the scene of her own demise. Her gaze passed over the block, the axe, and the masked man who was tasked with ending her life. Her expression, however, remained a placid mask, revealing nothing of her inner state. The official commission for the execution was then read aloud, a long and formal document detailing her alleged crimes and the legal basis for her death sentence. Mary listened with an air of detachment, her eyes occasionally closing as if in silent prayer. When it was finished and she was asked if she had any final words, she spoke. Her voice was clear, steady, and devoid of any tremor as she declared her innocence of the plots against Elizabeth, while simultaneously professing her lifelong Catholic faith and her hope that England might one day return to it. This was not a plea, but a final testament. With the formalities concluded, Mary's two female attendants stepped forward to help her disrobe, a standard part of the ritual for the condemned. They were to be stripped of all worldly markers of rank before death. But as her servants began to remove the outer gown of black velvet, sharp gasps of shock rippled through the audience. Beneath her somber mourning clothes, Mary was wearing a bodice and petticoat of deep, shocking crimson. It was the color of blood, the liturgical color of martyrdom in the Catholic Church. The message was immediate, deliberate, and powerful. Mary was staging her own death, not as a convicted traitor to the English crown, but as a martyr for her faith. The crimson silk seemed to radiate with a life of its own in the hall's dim, gray light, transforming her in an instant from a political prisoner into a religious icon before the very eyes of her Protestant executioners. Her servants, their hands trembling and eyes welling with tears they fought to hold back, completed their task. Mary then walked with steady steps toward the block. She paused briefly to forgive the executioner for the act he was about to perform, a traditional gesture of magnanimity for nobles facing the axe, yet one that would gain a terrible poignancy in the moments to come. She knelt, carefully arranging her crimson skirts as if she were preparing for a court ceremony rather than her own beheading. A tense, suffocating silence gripped the hall as the final preparations were made. Mary placed her head upon the block, her soft Latin prayers the only sound that could be heard. Her hands, now bound, clutched a small ivory crucifix, her last and final act of defiance against the Protestant realm that had condemned her. The executioner lifted his heavy axe high. The crowd collectively held its breath, and the world seemed to pause, braced for an act of justice that would instead become an atrocity. The first blow came down with a sickening, wet thud that echoed through the stunned silence. But it was a botched strike. Instead of a clean cut to the neck that would have brought a mercifully quick end, the axe blade struck the back of Mary's skull, biting deep into bone but missing the vital point entirely. A collective gasp of horror erupted from the witnesses as Mary's body convulsed on the platform. A low, involuntary moan of agony escaped her lips, the first and only sound of pain she had allowed herself to make. Blood began to pool on the black cloth as the executioner, his own hands now shaking from the ghastly realization of his failure, heaved the axe up once more. To the absolute horror of the onlookers, Mary's fingers twitched, a sign that she was still conscious, her body refusing to surrender to death despite the catastrophic wound. The solemn act of state justice had instantly degenerated into a grotesque butchery that would haunt every person present for the rest of their lives. The second blow was delivered with desperate, frantic force, this time hitting the base of her neck. But the executioner's composure was gone, his aim ruined by the horror of his first mistake. The axe cut deep into the flesh and bone but failed to fully sever the head, leaving it hanging grotesquely by a shred of sinew and skin as her lifeblood pumped freely onto the black-draped scaffold. The only sounds were the executioner's ragged, panicked breaths behind his mask, mingled with his own whispered curses and prayers. For what felt like an eternity, Mary's body lay horrifically suspended between life and death while the executioner seemed paralyzed by the magnitude of his incompetence. The official witnesses were frozen in shock, unsure whether to intervene or to let the gruesome spectacle continue. Some of the women in the crowd had turned away, weeping openly, while others stared, trapped in a state of morbid fascination. Driven by sheer desperation, the executioner swung the axe a third time, bringing it down with all the force he could muster. This time, mercifully, the blade finished its grisly work. Mary's head was finally separated from her tortured body, the impact sending a spray of blood spattering across the scaffold and onto the nearest witnesses. The sharp crack of the axe striking the wooden block beneath finally signaled the end of one of the most horrifically mismanaged executions in history. But the indignities were not over. As the executioner bent down to pick up the head, intending to hold it aloft for the crowd in the customary final gesture. His hand grasped only a wig of auburn curls. Mary's head dropped from his hand and rolled back onto the scaffold with a dull thud, revealing her own natural hair, thin, short, and shockingly gray, aged prematurely by years of stress and imprisonment. The image of the beautiful, vibrant queen was stripped away in death, revealing a middle-aged woman worn down by a lifetime of suffering. As if the scene could not become any more surreal or tragic, a small commotion started near the base of the scaffold. From out of the blood-soaked folds of Mary's crimson skirts emerged her small Skye Terrier, which had hidden itself there and accompanied its mistress all the way to the block. The tiny dog, its white fur now matted and stained with its mistress's blood, began to run in confused, frantic circles around her headless body, whimpering piteously as it searched for the woman who could never comfort it again. The immediate aftermath in the great hall was one of stunned, horrified silence, which soon gave way to frantic activity. Servants rushed to dismantle and remove the blood-drenched scaffold, while officials began the desperate process of figuring out how to report the unmitigated disaster to Queen Elizabeth in London. The hall, a stage for centuries of royal history, had been turned into a charnel house, forever stained by the memory of that morning's events. The reaction of the witnesses was immediate and visceral. Robert Melville, Mary's devoted secretary who had served her through all her years of captivity, stood with tears streaming unchecked down his face. In letters he wrote in the immediate aftermath, his usual diplomatic reserve was completely shattered. He described the scene as the most pitiful sight that ever was seen, a detailed and gut-wrenching account that is now preserved in the Scottish archives. Dr. Bourgoin, Mary's French physician, offered a more clinical but no less damning assessment. He later testified that in all his years of attending executions across Europe, he had never witnessed such staggering incompetence. His medical expertise allowed him to note with precision that the first blow had only fractured Mary's skull without severing the vital arteries, thereby prolonging her agony for no reason. His testimony would prove crucial in the inquiries that followed. Even the Earl of Shrewsbury, one of the primary commissioners overseeing the execution and Mary's longtime jailer, was seen to turn pale and tremble after the first botched strike, profoundly moved and troubled by the butchery he had witnessed. His official report to the Queen was conspicuously brief, glossing over the gruesome details. The commoners who had been handpicked to spread news of the execution did their job, but not in the way the government had intended. Instead of carrying tales of a traitor's just end, they spread stories of horror. A local blacksmith later recounted how he went expecting to see justice served but instead witnessed a butchery most foul, an act unfit for any Christian. Testimonies like these traveled quickly, and in the popular imagination, Mary the traitor was rapidly transformed into Mary the martyr. The executioner himself, whose name was kept secret for his own safety, reportedly fled Fotheringhay in shame immediately after the proceedings. Accounts suggest he was found dead several days later, though whether it was from guilt, fear of reprisal, or a more sinister silencing remains a historical mystery. His assistant was said to have been so deeply traumatized that he abandoned the profession entirely and sought refuge in a monastery. News of the bungled execution reached Queen Elizabeth I within hours. Her reaction was a masterclass in political theater. She reportedly fainted upon hearing the details, expressing performative horror and fury to distance herself from the grim reality of the act she had authorized. But her focus quickly shifted to damage control. The international repercussions were swift and severe. In Spain, King Philip II, who was already amassing his great armada, seized upon Mary's martyrdom as the ultimate justification for a holy war against heretical England. His ships would later sail under banners depicting Mary's gruesome death. Pamphlets with lurid, graphic descriptions of the execution circulated across Catholic Europe, solidifying Mary's image as a saint-like figure whose suffering demanded vengeance. Pope Sixtus V, who had been ambivalent toward Mary in life, now championed her cause in death, using the story as powerful propaganda for the Counter-Reformation. The botched nature of her death was a gift to her allies. It achieved for Mary in martyrdom the reverence that had so often eluded her in life. In Scotland, Mary's son, James VI, was trapped in an impossible political position. Having tacitly accepted his mother's death as the price for his own future succession to the English throne, he now had to perform public outrage to satisfy his own people without angering Elizabeth. His carefully worded protests ultimately pleased no one. The execution would become a lasting symbol of English arrogance, creating a resentment that would poison Anglo-Scottish relations for generations. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, marked a profound turning point. For centuries, the concept of the divine right of kings had shielded even deposed monarchs. Mary's death at the hands of the state shattered that sacred assumption, setting a direct precedent that would be invoked less than a century later during the English Civil War, when her own great-grandson, Charles I, faced the same fate. The idea that royal blood offered no final protection from the consequences of political action was born. The horrific details of her death also planted the seeds of a new debate. The graphic descriptions of her prolonged suffering, spread far and wide, gave ammunition to those who questioned the very nature of capital punishment, challenging whether any execution could truly be humane. The story of Mary's end has continued to resonate through the centuries, retold in ballads, paintings, and films, not because of the political complexities, but because of the universal human themes it embodies. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of suffering and dignity. We are drawn to the image of grace maintained in the face of unspeakable adversity. Mary became a legend not because she was proven innocent, the political charges against her held weight, but because she faced an ugly, brutal death with a profound and beautiful composure. Perhaps the most enduring symbol of the entire tragedy remains the image of the small, blood-stained dog, whimpering and searching for its dead mistress. In that innocent creature's grief and bewilderment, the immense cost of political calculation is laid bare in purely human terms. The dog's simple, unconditional loyalty stands as a silent rebuke to the complex justifications of church and state that brought Mary to the scaffold and left her to die so horribly. The tragedy at Fotheringhay Castle is a stark reminder that the grand sweep of history often turns on the fallibility of ordinary people given extraordinary tasks. Elizabeth's government sought a clean, quiet political solution, but the executioner's failure created a propaganda disaster that strengthened the very cause they meant to destroy. In the end, Mary's dignity in the face of incompetent brutality, her final, masterful performance as a queen, may be her most powerful and lasting legacy.